And now onto our feature presentation. I would like to introduce Chris Nelder to you all. He is the creator and host of the Energy Transition Show podcast. Chris has written about energy and investing for more than a decade. He is the author of 2 books on energy and investing, as well as more than 200 articles on energy in publications such as Nature, Scientific American, Slate, The Atlantic, Quartz, Financial Times, Green Tech Media, Smart Planet, and The Economist Intelligence Unit. He is also a manager in the mobility practice at the Rocky Mountain Institute in Boulder, Colorado, where he heads the EV grid integration team. He enjoys bantering with other energy geeks on Twitter at Chris Nelder is how you can find him, his handle. And we are so pleased to have him with us today for our presentation. So Chris, I'm going to thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to turn the screen over to you, and I will be back for the moderated Q&A when you're done your presentation. All right.
Now, okay, there we go. I got to put $1 in the mute jar. Okay, thanks very much, Heather, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for spending your part of your Saturday with me. I want to share with you some of the trends that I'm seeing in energy transition. And as Heather has indicated, Energy Transition is the name of my podcast, the Energy Transition Show, and it's kind of what I'm all about. So I'm really pleased to share with you some current trends. And basically, we're just going to walk through some charts here. To begin with, I want to point out here, you'll see these little boxes in the upper right-hand corner where it says episode dot something. These are episodes of my podcast that you can go to learn more about each of these slides. So in this particular chart, we're talking about how renewables are taking over in the UK, and we elaborated on that in episode 47 of the podcast. So if you just look at these trends, you can see that this is for the UK. And it's for grid power, and this is for the UK. I'm sorry, as I just said, for the UK. So you can see how grid power produced from fossil fuels, as the blue line, has been steadily declining since 2009 as renewables grew. And as of the third quarter of 2019, renewables actually surpassed fossil fuels for the first time. And in 2020, there were a number of weeks and then months that the UK produced no power at all from coal for the first time since the Industrial Revolution began in the late 19th century. There used to be a joke about bringing coals to Newcastle. We may have to start doing that because Newcastle is not going to be producing much more coal. Let's take a look at coal a little more closely here from a global level. This is kind of a complex chart, but you can see that what we're talking about here is net global coal power capacity. So, the blue or more purple and green lines above the 0 line, those are additions per year. And then the kind of beige and orange bars falling below the line, those are subtractions per year, coal plants that were retired. And you can see that China, which is those big purple bars, was adding a lot of coal capacity every year. But that has been declining. The amount of coal capacity they're adding each year has been slowly falling. So if you might remember people saying things like, well, China's building a new coal plant, every 2-3 days. A decade ago, that was true. That's no longer the case. And if you want to understand what coal power really looks like on a net basis, look at those 2 lines cutting across the bars. So that dotted line is the net change in coal power capacity without China. Okay, so without China, global coal power capacity has been falling on net since the end of 2017. So for more than 3 years, except for China, global coal power capacity has been declining. And including China, it'll start falling on an absolute basis within the next few years. We go into much more detail about what's happening in China, why they're building coal plants, and actually why they shouldn't be in episode 138. Global coal use is fading globally, really. So this chart shows that rising black line is capacity, so you can see that that's just going up every single year. But the blue line is the capacity factor, which is an indication of how much the coal plants are actually running. And, again, if you go back to, say, 2004, 2005, coal plants were running as they always had been, sort of at that 90% level. They're running 90% of the time. That's no longer the case. In 2018, which was where this chart ends, that was down to 55% globally. And when coal plants get down to about 50% capacity factor, when we're only running them about half the time, they tend to start getting shut down. That's certainly the case here in the U.S. This is a topic that we delved into in greater detail in episode 18, up there in the right-hand corner. You can see that. So this is an important thing to understand, because although new coal plants might be getting built, that doesn't necessarily mean they're running. And this is particularly true in China. So what do we actually have here in China? Well, if you look at that red line kind of bouncing up and down on the chart, that's new coal capacity that's getting built. And then the blue line is the utilization rate. And as you can see, that utilization rate fell below 50%, which I've indicated here with the dotted red line, back in 2015. And it really has not been above that 50% line since. So even though China has continued to build significant numbers of new coal plants, those plants are running less than half the time. This indicates that not only is it sort of an incorrect indicator or misleading indicator to just look at the new power capacity that's being built, like how many new coal-fired power plants they're building per year. It also doesn't tell you that the existing fleet is running so little that it's actually more likely to be shut down than to be used. And really, outside of China, a lot of people have worried that, once China had sort of completed its big expansion into the, sort of tier one kind of country, once it had fully industrialized, that it would be easier to switch over to other renewables. But then the coal torch, if you will, would pass to other developing nations, in particular India. But in fact, that's not what we're seeing. India's coal use actually peaked in 2017 or in 2018. And in 2016, 2017, its capacity factor was only 57%. And in fact, 2/3 of net new capacity installed across India for the past 2 years was renewable. So India is not turning to coal to power its industrialization, as many people expected, and neither is the rest of Southeast Asia. And these are topics that we covered in depth with a terrific analyst from IEFA in episodes 91 and 93. So if you want to know what's happening in India, you should check those episodes out. But, as you can see, that big purple block at the bottom, that's coal. That has been decidedly declining for several years now. Whereas solar and wind, the yellow and blue bars at the top of the chart there, are growing steadily. And eventually those should take over grid power in India. So let's take a look at the rest of Asia. Really, across the whole region, South and Southeast Asia, they are also turning away from coal. In fact, coal has no significant growth potential left anywhere in the world. So you can see that in this chart, we're showing you Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, Bangladesh. Yes, 5 years ago, we were very rightfully concerned about how much new coal power capacity they were building. But look at what we've got down there in 2021. It's really, really falling off. And again, because wind and solar are now cheaper than coal in most of the world, this trend will continue. There is not going to be some big rebound in coal consumption worldwide. So let's switch over to gas here a little bit. As you can see, well, let me walk through this chart a little bit. So on the left, you've got the cost of electricity in terms of dollars per megawatt in real 2019 dollars. And then we've got the years along the x-axis. So in this case, we're looking at sort of an indicative combined cycle gas-fired power plant in the Northeast. And that sort of orange line cutting across the middle of the chart, that's the cost of building and operating a new gas plant. And the dotted orange line below it is the cost of operating an existing gas plant. And so what this chart is showing you is that under the Clean Energy Power Plan, I believe this came from an RMI study some years ago, that's the blue line descending on the left there. The cost of providing power through a clean energy portfolio has already fallen below the cost of building and operating new gas plants in the Northeast for a combined cycle gas plant. And around that 2030 to 2035 range, somewhere in there, it will fall below the cost of operating an existing gas plant. So even though gas has continued to be a competitive fuel and has played an important role in pushing coal off the grid, it's also about to get pushed off the grid by renewables. And so we discussed this in more detail in episode 130. I wanted to give you a snapshot of what's happening here in the U.S. Renewable generation in the past year has surpassed coal and is now equal to nuclear. We're now generating 20% of our power from renewables, that's including hydro, and 20% from nuclear, whereas coal is now just 19% of grid power. And again, if you have in your mind, the way things were a decade ago, coal in the U.S. was producing 45% of our power in 2010. And if you go back a couple of years before that, it was fully 50% of the U.S. power supply. And back then, a lot of people were saying, I just can't imagine how renewables could ever displace that. Well, look what happened. Over the past decade, that share has been cut in less than half of what it was. And renewables and natural gas have picked up that slack, whereas nuclear has maintained a consistent share. It hasn't grown, and nor will it. So what we're going to see next, if you could imagine extending this chart out into the future, is that natural gas share is no longer going to increase. It'll start shrinking, and renewables are going to gradually eat up the market share for the majority of grid power. And sometime 2-3 decades from now, perhaps, it'll be on the order of 80% renewable power. And then we're going to have to figure out how we're going to meet that last 20%, which I have thoughts about that may surprise you. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about those in the Q&A. But anyway, this is a picture that we discussed in more detail in episode 124. And really, renewables, really the story is the same globally. Renewables are taking over across the world. They're now the dominant source of new generation for power and the cheapest source of new power for 2/3 of the global population, period. And that's just unsubsidized. They're just cheaper. And in fact, more solar was installed in the past decade than anything else. That's that yellow bar at the bottom. And again, you can compare that to coal in China and to the rest of the world in the top line. So we're actually installing more solar capacity than coal, and once you take into account the respective capacity factors of coal plants and solar plants, it's not hard to see how on a net generation basis you'll actually find that solar is now is about to push coal off the grid along with wind. So hydro, wind, and solar are growing nicely. Again, as I've shown you in the previous charts, I don't think gas or coal are going to grow anymore. In fact, we should expect them to decline. And we got into this in a bit more detail in episode 124. So let's have a look at solar a little closer, since that's now the dominant source of new power generation. I realize this is a complex chart here from BNEF, but basically this is showing you new construction of PV by country by year. And under their conservative scenario, you can see these sort of last 3 bars here under the conservative group. They're expecting continued steady growth in solar, more or less in line with previous years. And that's happening all across the world. Again, note that those red bars there, that's China. China is building more solar than anybody else by a big margin. The next largest country to be building solar is, well, in this case, it's a region, it's Europe. And after that, North America and the Caribbean. So we are seeing very strong growth in solar worldwide. And if you look in that group of bars on the right-hand side there, there are some even more significant growth outlooks available in their optimistic outlook in this BNEF report. So just keep this in mind as you think about the future of the power sector. It's changing and is changing rapidly. What you have in mind, even about the state of the power sector today, let alone what it was 10 years ago, is wildly out of date because this is all changing so quickly. One of the interesting things here to me is that utility scale solar plants are increasingly being built with storage at first construction rather than just building like a solar farm and then trying to paste some storage onto it afterwards. They're coming as solar plus storage plants right out of the box. And so this is showing you the cost of these plants on a levelized basis. Well, actually, this is the power purchase agreement prices in terms of US dollars per megawatt hour. And you can see, going back 5 years, the Crescent Dunes concentrating solar plant was pretty pricey. That's, at $135 per megawatt hour. That's not where we are now. We're now regularly seeing projects in the 40 to even down to low $30 per megawatt hour, and that's for solar and storage. Okay, so these plants are actually dispatchable. These plants are actually able to run for 4 hours or more after the sun goes down. So these are prices that we used to see for just solar utility scale solar plants as being like, wow, look at how cheap this stuff is. That's now the price that you get when storage is included in the plant. So this is really remarkable stuff. And at these prices, you can see why other kinds of generation just can't compete. Like, these are prices that even a gas plant is going to struggle to compete with. And we got into a lot more detail on storage plus solar arrays in episode 58, if you want to check that out. So really what we're seeing is just incredibly low prices for renewable energy worldwide. And this is something we talked about in episode 132. In the US, some of the more recent headline projects are $19 a megawatt hour for a project by 8 Minute Solar Energy for the Los Angeles Department of Power and Water rather. It's really incredible. $19 a megawatt hour. That's under 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Solar and storage under $40 per megawatt hour this year. Under $32 per megawatt hour by 2023. Wind also equipped with storage in the U.S. is now down to that sort of same range at $21 per megawatt hour. That's here in Colorado, a project by Xcel. In Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the Middle East, we're even getting lower, down to $17 or even $13 a megawatt hour. Again, that's 1.3 cents per kilowatt hour for solar power in Abu Dhabi. Offshore wind is even getting into these kind of price brackets. I mean, again, this stuff used to be a couple $100 per megawatt hour. Now we're looking at $50 per megawatt hour for offshore wind in the UK in the next couple of years. And that's versus the wholesale market's reference price of $61 per megawatt hour under the subsidy regime. So this shows you that subsidies are not even necessary for offshore wind anymore. And in the U.S., we're seeing that down to $74 a megawatt hour for delivery in 2022 and $65 a megawatt hour for delivery in 2023. These are prices that we can expect to continue to fall. And when it gets to the point where it's competitive against all fossil fuel generation, we should expect this sector to really take off because the resource magnitude is just absolutely immense. Let's have a look at what's happening with lithium-ion battery costs, because that is a key element of obviously the storage prices that I was just showing you. Again, go back a decade ago, we were paying over $1,000 per kilowatt hour of storage capacity. That's now down to 135 last year. And by 2024, it's expected to fall below $100 per kilowatt hour. At below $100 per kilowatt hour, a lot of interesting things are expected to happen. We're expecting it to have a major impact on not only grid power, but also making electric vehicles cheaper to buy than a conventional petroleum burning vehicle. Once we get to that below $100 a kilowatt hour cost. So this is very positive, and as you can see, this price curve is still declining very reliably, and it will continue to decline. And we went into this a little more deeply in episode 75. So because the cost of batteries is falling so consistently, vehicle electrification is now basically inevitable. This is a chart from Bloomberg New Energy Finance from their long-term vehicle outlook 2019. And as you can see, buses are definitely the dominant form of vehicle electrification now, and are expected to take a larger and larger market share in the coming years, followed by light commercial vehicles, and then passenger vehicles, and then finally medium and heavy duty commercial vehicles. All of those things are on track to eventually just completely take over. My team at RMI recently did a report where we surveyed a bunch of fleet managers of all different kinds of fleets, from long haul, trucking companies to package delivery companies, right down to, state agencies that run small fleets of passenger vehicles. All of them expect battery electric vehicles to completely take over the mobility market, and none of them expect any other competition of note from either hydrogen fuel cell vehicles or gasoline vehicles or diesel. The game is basically over for those types of vehicles, although some people participating in those sectors and some of those manufacturers may not have yet admitted it. Many other manufacturers have. And so we're seeing very strong commitments being made by most of the vehicle manufacturers to, for example, make all of the light duty vehicles in their product lines full battery electric by 2030. That's become kind of a common benchmark among many of the major manufacturers. And really, this is driven purely by cost. It's just cheaper to own these vehicles. Once you take into account, all the maintenance costs and the servicing costs, as well as the fuel costs for all these different vehicle cases. So what can we conclude from this data so far? Well, there's some really easy conclusions. First of all, coal is dead. It's not coming back. There's no way that it's ever going to compete with renewables ever again. If we're not at peak gas plant now, we soon will be, because as that previous chart showed you, there's no longer really an economic case for building new gas plants. Renewables are just cheaper. New nuclear is unlikely to be built anywhere in the world except China, and that's strictly because it's a command economy, and they can set targets and require the plants to be built even if they don't make economic sense. Anywhere in the world where economics matter, no more nuclear is going to be built. Renewables are going to continue to be the marginal new source of power globally from now on. Also, we don't really need any more firming or dispatchable capacity. If we just keep our existing fleet of gas plants around, we can use them for the remaining dispatchable capacity that we need. I've covered a bunch of studies that have demonstrated this in modeling. So for those who really want to delve into those details, you can find them in our podcast. The other thing I'd like to point out is that all of this stuff is basically happening because of economics. And it is on track to basically accomplish the energy transition for both transportation and for grid power without any of these new exotic technologies that are being hyped rather aggressively right now, such as equipping fossil fuel plants with carbon capture and sequestration, or small modular or other kinds of next generation nuclear reactors, the so-called hydrogen economy, and so on. These are often held up as sort of silver bullets. I would point out that none of them exist yet at commercial scale, and frankly, I don't think we need them. Another thing that's very simple to conclude here is that all ground transportation is going full battery electric and not hydrogen. So how are we doing on emissions? Let's switch over to the climate context here for a minute. Obviously, emissions have been climbing steadily for a long time in the developing parts of the world and in the world as a whole, as you can see by those top three lines. However, as we just showed, because of the declining trends in building new coal and gas capacity in those major developing countries of China and India, I don't think these lines are going to continue going up the way they have been. And if you look at the world rate, it's actually starting to flatten out a bit. And the reason for that is that in the major developing countries, including Canada, the United States, and the European Union, we're actually seeing annual CO2 emission rates starting to fall. So we are starting to make some real progress on CO2 emissions, although clearly we still have a long way to go. The point of this chart is not to say that everything's going to be fine. It is to say that we are no longer on an absolute doom trend. We are reducing emissions in a real way in the developed world, and there's plenty of reason to think that we can start reducing them as well in the developing world. I want to dwell a minute here on this chart because, well, first of all, it's really complicated. And I'm sorry about that. I tried very, very hard to find the right chart for this slide, and this is honestly the best one I could find. What we're going to talk about here is the outlooks for the climate based on the IPCC's framework, in which they're using what they call shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs. So these are narratives that describe how the future might evolve, and then the so-called RCPs, the representative concentration pathways for CO2, and those things are combined in what they call integrated assessment models, or IAMs. I'm sorry, I didn't make this stuff up. This is just how the IPCC framework works. And so what we're looking at here are scenarios for the IPCC's sixth assessment, which is the one that's under development now. And this chart was produced by Energy Transition Show producer, my business partner, Justin Ritchie, who teaches at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And we covered all of this carbon budget stuff and these IPCC scenarios at great length in episodes 49, 112, 116, and 117, among others. So this chart that Justin has produced here is showing us that this climate doom scenario that you've probably heard about, which has been written about in the literature far more than any other scenario, known as RCP 8.5. That's this black triangle in the upper right-hand corner. That represents a world in which at the end of this century, we're looking at over 5 degrees of warming. So that's that top scale there is degrees of warming. That is not going to happen. In order for that to happen, we would have to have an explosion of coal use this century that, as I just showed you from the previous charts, is simply not going to happen. So it's extremely irresponsible the way that many analysts and modelers and just people who write about climate futures have treated this scenario, because it is not going to happen. In fact, as Michael Liebreich, the founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, puts it, RCP 8.5 is bollocks. It's just not in the cards. So all of the stories that you've read about our impending climate doom are based on that RCP 8.5 scenario. It is not going to happen. Where are we now? Where we are now is at about 1 degree of warming, or 1.5, depending on which baseline you're looking at. And that's basically encapsulated down over here at about 2.6, RCP 2.6 under the SSP1 framework. But just look at that little block of green arrows or triangles here. That's more or less where we are now. And the IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario would give us that kind of a future. According to the IEA's latest report, which is represented by this blue line, that points at this blue group of triangles here, that's under today's stated policies. And the line above it, the orange one, that points at this sort of orange group of triangles. That's the IEA's current policies. So just today, where we are now, like if we did nothing different from what we're doing today, we would not have warming more than 3 degrees C. Now that's still much higher than it needs to be. We need to get down to that sort of 1.52 degrees world. But what this is telling you is that if we did nothing more than what we did today, we would have, less than 3 degrees of warming. And if we go for the sustainable development scenario that the IEA has recommended, we're going to keep warming limited down to about 1.7 degrees C. So this is very much in range of our capabilities and within range of our current policies. Again, this is a very complex chart. I'm sorry for that. This is extremely complicated stuff. There's a reason that I spent more than 4 episodes of the podcast discussing it. But Justin's work, along with the work of many others, bears this out. And for those who are interested in exploring these scenarios further and what our climate future really looks like, unlike the sort of hair on fire stories you've read about it, I would highly recommend that you look at those 4 episodes just for starters. So to wrap up, I want to give some high-level summary slides to show that the energy transition is in fact possible and affordable. So here's the result of a study done by Vibrant Clean Energy. That's Christopher Clack's group here in Boulder. And this is from a study they did for Colorado, which we covered in episode 111 at the end of 2019. And this is showing that basically by going for full electrification and decarbonization, that is converting space heating and vehicles over to electric, it'll save the state $4.8 billion by 2040 over just continuing the way things are today. And the deeper you go with decarbonization to replace coal and gas with wind, solar, and storage, the more savings you get. So that is a very positive result. Here's what it looks like for the United States as a whole. And we covered this particular study in episode 129 and 131. This was the result of an extremely detailed and complex study involving researchers from many different countries over many years. And basically this is kind of the snapshot of the outcome of their model. They're showing essentially that decarbonizing the U.S. by 2050 is possible and affordable. Under this scenario, electricity is 90% wind and solar in 6 out of 7 of the scenarios they modeled. Nearly all vehicles go fully electric by 2050, and 79% of space heating and 53% of water heating are switched over to electric heat pumps. And the total cost of doing this full energy transition by 2050 is less than 0.5% of GDP. Very affordable, very doable, nothing magic. It's just plain cheaper. And here's a look at the world decarbonization. This is from another study that we featured in episode 95 by a group of researchers headed by Christian Breyer at Lappeenranta University of Technology in Finland. Again, this was a big study conducted by many researchers over a period of years in multiple countries. And this is, one snapshot of their final modeling showing how decarbonization could be done by 2050. And what this shows you is that the existing reliance, this is just electricity, the existing reliance on things like, gas turbines and so on, declines and is gradually replaced by wind and solar primarily, with a bit of geothermal and biomass essentially thrown in there. So with this particular scenario, you get the world to zero emissions before 2050. It actually limits warming to 1.5 degrees C with a cost-effective 100% renewable energy system. It does not require negative carbon technology, so there's no CCS in this model. and it provides all the energy needed for electricity, heat, transport, and actually water desalination worldwide by 2050. So it's possible and affordable. And I will wrap it up there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Chris. That was a lot to cover in a short time. I appreciate you going through all that. Thank you very much.
Indeed.
I feel like of course we only touched the surface on many of those, and people will need to listen to the full podcast for a lot of detail that you had to go over quickly with us. One quick point to clarify: we're in the middle of a controversy where our provincial government's selling off our mountains for metallurgical coal. And I just wanted to make sure, for a pittance, by the way. And I just wanted, my assumption is none of your graphs are about metallurgical coal. They are about thermal coal. Is that correct? We just had some people wondering.
Yeah, that's correct. All of the charts that I was just showing related to coal are just about power generation.
Yeah, okay, great. Just wanted to make sure I clarified that for the audience right off the bat, because just because of the local context we're in and the coal we're talking about lately in Alberta. So great, thank you. So we've got a lot of questions here for you. Of course, I think you touched on it in your last graph, but you mentioned that you were going to get into more detail about that last 20% during the Q&A. And we were getting questions in the Q&A throughout about, how do we get to 100% renewable, particularly given that we are moving to EVs and that we are going to have increased electricity need because we're going all electric. So, with that additional need, then how do we get to the 100% renewables?
Right. So this is a very popular question, and without being flip, it continues to puzzle me why. We will not be getting to an 80% renewable energy system globally for probably at least another 20 years. It may take longer than that. So why does anyone think it's essential for us to understand how we're going to get from 80 to 100% 20 or 30 years from now today? My point of view is let's get to 80% first and then see what the options look like 20 to 30 years from now. Because the options that we have 20 to 30 years from now are going to be probably quite different from the options that we have today. So, I've seen a lot of models to show, what they think the future grid would look like to get to 100% renewable powered system. And guess what? They all rely on the data that's available today for what does storage cost? What kinds of storage technologies are available? What does battery storage cost? What does thermal storage cost? What do all the other, types of energy technologies cost today? They do not model what those energy costs are going to be 30 years from now, which is, of course, what matters. So it continues to confound me why anyone thinks that we need to know how we're going to get from 80 to 100% when we're at, more or less 20% today. Let's get to 80% first and then see what the options look like. And my guess is that, when you really break down the models of what does that last 20% need to do, that last 20% of energy power supply, when you get, when you're trying to get from 80 to 100% renewable system, what is that energy actually needed for? And as far as I can tell, a great deal of that energy is actually going to be needed to provide space heating, because it's happening during what they call the Dunkelflaute, the windless winter weeks in the northern countries, in particular in Europe. If heat is what you need that power for, you actually probably don't want to use electricity provided in the form of battery storage to meet that need. You actually want a heat-based solution. And my guess is that 20 to 30 years from now, when we actually get to that point, we're going to have a number of low temperature heat solutions that are going to be used to provide that space heating, and we're not going to need that grid power at all. Mm-hmm. So there's some really bad models being done now that make heroic attempts to try to figure out, exactly what the energy composition of the total system looks like 20 to 30 years from now. Frankly, I think it's a complete waste of time. I wouldn't even bother with that modeling. Let's just get to 80% and then see what the solutions actually look like and what they actually cost. because guaranteed it is not going to be what we're modeling today.
Yes, and here in Alberta, we're still trying to get to 30%. So I think we even have a ways to go before we can worry about 80%. So I appreciate that. Here's another question from our audience. What storage technology do you think will be the king of the energy system? Uh, there are many examples they've given here, but I'm just going to let you answer that question.
Um, well, again, at the risk of being flip, is that really the question we should be asking? Like, why do we need to know which one is the king? Isn't the whole, if we're going to stick with that metaphor, isn't the whole court appropriate and important, right? Isn't there also an important role for the queens and the princes and so on to play? I think that the future composition of storage technologies is going to be a portfolio of different technologies, no matter what your scenario is, and that's as it should be. We're going to have some storage provided by batteries. We're going to have some storage, hopefully, provided by strictly thermal solutions. Again, I think things like underground thermal energy storage, again, just low temperature storage is super useful and interesting for space heating. We're going to continue to have fast response, short duration kinds of storage like flywheels and so on that are currently used on the grid to do things like frequency regulation or voltage support. We're going to probably have some hydrogen used for certain niche applications, especially for applications where you need very long duration, very large quantities of storage. We're going to probably see other kinds of batteries. There are many, many kinds, dozens and dozens of battery chemistries in the labs right now. And, we didn't really start doing serious research on batteries until about 10 years ago. Prior to that, we'd spent literally a century doing nothing on battery research. And so there's lots of different battery chemistries and technologies in development now, including other, kinds of batteries like flow batteries that are just now becoming commercial. So I'm not really that interested in which one is going to be the king. I'm interested in the full portfolio and how they all sort of have different capabilities and will be used for different purposes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think one of the themes I'm picking up on throughout the solar show is just that need for a diverse energy system. And of course, that would include a diverse battery storage system. So I appreciate
Absolutely.
that. Another question for you around your graphs. Everybody loved them, by the way, and they're wanting to know, where do they get graphs like that? Did you make them all? Do you source them? Do you have really cool places you go for data? They want to be able to nerd out with you.
I appreciate that. I took pains to put the source of all of my graphs into the notes of every slide. So happy to share that information with anyone. I did not make any of these charts. I found them, and they were not always easy to find.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are having to weed through a lot of crap out there to find the good stuff. So I think if people can look in the notes of your slide deck after when we send that around, that would be so wonderful for everybody to be able to find the good sources out there during these challenging times where trolls are plentiful, as we mentioned and discussed on Wednesday.
Well, it's also the case that I have now spent the better part of 20 years looking for these charts. So
Yeah.
I've plowed through lots and lots and lots of sources to come up with the nuggets.
Yes, you can be our librarian of sorts. We appreciate that. So here's another question, and of course, this being Alberta, people have oil and gas on the mind. We see oil and gas companies pledging to go net zero. Do you think this is a positive global trend or just greenwashing?
There's nothing wrong with setting a net zero target in and of itself, I suppose, but it has to be followed with action. And setting a distant net zero target, like, well, we're going to go net zero by 2050, without saying exactly what you're going to do next year and the year after that and the year after that, um, you know, that's useless. Setting a distant net zero target and that's all is equivalent to pledging to do net zero today.
Hmm. Hmm. And I have a question personally. You talked about China at the beginning, and of course, there's all sorts of propaganda out there suggesting that all of our goals are impossible because of China, and it's nice to hear a realistic perspective that that actually China is transitioning just as fast as the rest of us, and that's not a reason for us not to take action. But I guess I wonder, why are they building all those new plants if they're not even using them or they're not running them much? Like, what is the rationale for that in the first place? I know you're not Chinese, but I know you've studied it a lot.
Yes, well, again, episode 138, we go into a lot of detail about exactly why that's happening.
Good. Okay. We'll have to go and listen to that one. And we have a question here. Oh, people would like you to name your books, please, because they're going to go and read your books. And I didn't mention the names.
I appreciate that. They're both, frankly, they feel a little bit dated now. So the first was Profit from the Peak, which, despite the names on the cover, I wrote completely. My quote unquote co author didn't write a word of that book. That was just my boss at the time. Yeah, Profit from the Peak was a book that I wrote in 2007. And obviously, the theme of it was peak oil, which is something that I had spent the better part of a decade studying in great depth. And the purpose of that book was to say, look, we have to get off of this stuff before, the phrase back then was we should get off of oil, or we should leave oil before it leaves us. And so that book was essentially an articulation of how we do that. It was an argument for energy transition and an argument for why we should not expect there to be a long future for oil. However, again, that book was written in 2007 and reflected about a decade of study I had done previous to that. It was after that that fracking actually became a thing and really kind of changed the global outlook for oil. However, it did not put the lie to the problem of peak oil as many people thought it did. People who didn't pay attention to what peak oil was really about. They just looked at oil prices. Oil prices is not what peak oil and the theory and all the study below that was about. It was not just about price. There was a lot of dumb things said about peak oil back then, and still are, by people that were only looking at prices. But anyway, so that was the first one, was Profit from the Peak, where, I was basically articulating an early case for energy transition. And then the book was immediately followed on that was called Investing in Renewable Energy, which I co-authored with a couple of my colleagues at the time. And that's exactly what it says. It was, an explanation of different sectors in renewable energy that were starting to emerge and where we thought it would be good to invest in them. But again, that's going back 13 years now. And so the world has changed quite a bit since then.
Yeah, I mean, that was before any of the price changes, really, and the renewables. So it's amazing what's happened in 13 years. So the podcasts are really the most current and up-to-date source of information from Chris. I appreciate
Absolutely.
that. I think we have time for one last question, and I think it's going to be a doozy, but we're hearing a lot in Canada these days about the tariffs that our government is imposing on solar imports from around the world, and we're seeing a lot of political movement in the United States on renewables. So people are wondering in general, how important is government support in our transition and government policies? Can we make progress without government? Where would you go with that question?
Well, to be honest, we have made a lot of progress without government over the past decade.
Especially
Uh,
you folks in the US.
yeah, and I would consider that especially true in the U.S. over the course of the past 4 years. When we had an administration that did everything it could to put a thumb on the scale in favor of fossil fuels and everything it could to stop the progress of energy transition. And yet, the U.S. lost more jobs in the coal sector last year than it ever had before. And energy transition proceeded. And the costs for lithium ion batteries and electric vehicles and renewables kept falling. And the costs of coal and everything else continued going up, right? So that's despite federal policy. Federal policy is always going to make it easier and faster and cheaper to proceed with the energy transition. So it's a good thing, and you need that policy support. And a lot of what happens in the market follows on from policy. In fact, we just did an episode called Making Climate Policy Work, based on a book by a couple of researchers here in the US, critiquing why carbon markets have really not been very successful at reducing carbon emissions, but other kinds of policies that were much more targeted to specific sectors and technologies are very successful. So, policy is a really important underpinning. We wouldn't have the explosion of wind and solar in this country if we hadn't had these state-level renewable portfolio standards, for example. Those policies were really important in setting the groundwork and helping these new technologies, especially, helping them get from sort of 0 to 1 to cross that valley of death and become a commercially viable, competitive technology. But now wind and solar are there, electric vehicles are there, a lot of other technologies are getting to that point. And then I think the market becomes a more significant factor. But they're both important and both necessary.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking time for that question and all these others. I apologize we can't ask you more, but our time together has come to an end. And just want to thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time with us today and ending our solar show on a relatively optimistic note. And I appreciate that because we don't want to send everyone away depressed. So thank you for the encouragement. It makes us feel like the work that we're doing is going to make a difference in the world. So,
well, thank you. Thank you for having me on on your presentation here today. And I am absolutely very optimistic and excited about the future of energy transition. I think everybody else should be too. And I hope you'll all listen to my show. And I try to give a little dose of optimism and realism about all of this every 2 weeks. So tune in and join us.
We absolutely will. Thank you very much. So I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. I encourage you to join us for just the next half hour in the exhibitor booths. They're going to be live, so you can come and chat with our 14 exhibitors still. And we're going to hopefully make a good chunk of this information available to you via video and PowerPoint after. So you're welcome to stay tuned for those emails and notes from us about material that we can share with you later. The exhibitors, again, in our exhibitor booths that you can go to live are Aero Arc Welding Inc., ATCO, City of Edmonton's Change for Climate, Core Drilling Corp., Determination Drilling, Eco Solar Home Tour, Society of Alberta, Empower Energy Corp., Evergreen and Gold Renewable Energy, Cool Country Solar and Security, Lakeland College, Legacy Renewables, MCCAC, Sunset Renewables, TerraGen Solar Racking, and of course, Solar Alberta. It has been a pleasure to host you all for this duration of this solar show. Thank you very much for attending. We'll look forward to hosting you again in the future and do enjoy those booths for the next half an hour.